The elites laughed when the exhausted father dropped his coffee. They had no idea the German shepherd, sitting at his heel, had completed 40 classified missions. They had no idea the man had either. When armed mercenaries kicked the doors in 30 seconds later, the laughing stopped permanently. Hit like if you want to know what happened next. The Tuesday morning snow in Chicago fell the way it always did in late November, not gently, not dramatically, just steadily and without apology. As if the city had long since stopped expecting anything softer. Marcus Cole stood on the sidewalk outside the Meridian Dental Group on West Madison Street, zipping Lily's yellow parka up to her chin, with the careful precision of a man who had once threaded detonator wire in total darkness. She was 5 years old, and already a veteran of the dentist's chair, which she had informed him on the walkover was worse than Monster's daddy. Way worse. A comparison that made the corner of his mouth lift in the way it rarely did anymore. Rex sat at Marcus's left heel, perfectly still on the salted concrete, his amber eyes tracking the foot traffic with the quiet intensity of a security camera that had learned to breathe. He was a German shepherd, 90 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, and he wore a flat red vest with white block lettering that read, "Service animal do not pet." Most people obeyed the sign. Most people also crossed to the other side of the sidewalk when they saw him, which suited Marcus fine. They had nowhere to be. That was the plan. After the appointment, Lily had extracted a solemn promise. Hot chocolate. The fancy kind with whipped cream. The kind she had seen on a cooking show she wasn't technically supposed to be watching at 11 at night when she was supposed to be asleep. Marcus had agreed without negotiating because some battles were not worth the field. He had not paid close attention to where they were walking. He had been watching Rex, who had been watching a pigeon on a fire escape with the focused disapproval of a retired professional who found civilian behavior exhausting. And that was how Marcus Cole, former Navy SEAL, current freelance carpenter, and full-time father, pushed open the brass-handled door of the Meridian Lounge and walked into a room that had absolutely no interest in any of them. The hostess looked up from her podium, and her expression did the small practice thing that expensive places train their staff to do, the smile that means please leave without saying please leave. Her eyes dropped to Rex and the smile stopped entirely. "I'm sorry, sir, we don't allow pets." Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his faded Carhartt jacket and produced a laminated card, military issue the size of a driver's license. He set it on the podium without a word. The hostess read it. She looked at Rex. She looked back at the card. Rex sat with the serene patience of a monument. The hostess returned the card, stepped aside and said nothing further because there was nothing further to say. The card was from the Department of Defense, and Rex's service number was embossed in the lower right corner, and the word certified appeared in red. 3 tables away, a man named Derek Shaw watched this exchange with the particular irritation of someone who has never been told no and considers the word a personal insult. He was 38, junior managing partner at a hedge fund in the Willis Tower, and he was wearing a charcoal wool suit that cost more than Marcus earned in a month of Finnish carpentry. He leaned toward the colleague on his left and said something low and pointed, and 2 of the 4 men at the table chuckled into their flat whites. Marcus did not hear the words. He was watching Rex. As they moved toward the counter, Rex's tail slowed. His ears, which had been relaxed and forward, flattened slightly. His steps shortened. It was subtle, the kind of thing you would miss if you didn't know what you were looking at, but Marcus had been watching this dog's body for 6 years, across 3 combat deployments and 1 quiet life in Lincoln Square. And he knew every register of Rex's silence. The lounge was loud in the way. Expensive places are loud. The grind of an espresso machine. The clatter of ceramic 40 conversations happening at once, in a space designed to bounce sound off marble. Too much input, too many strangers. Rex found the wall beside the counter and sat against it. and Marcus crouched beside him for a moment, one hand flat on the dog's ribs, and said quietly, "Place. You're good." Rex exhaled through his nose. His eyes stayed open, scanning, but his shoulders dropped a fraction. It was not comfort exactly, it was the decision to override. In the far corner of the room, a woman in a charcoal cashmere blazer lowered her tablet 2 inches and watched the man and the dog with an expression that had nothing to do with the quarterly earnings report she had been reviewing. Vivian Hart was 41 CEO of Hart Aerospace, and she had funded the K-9 military integration program that had trained Rex 6 years ago. She had reviewed the program files. She knew what the number inside a service dog's left ear meant. She looked at the number. She looked at the man. She set her tablet face down on the table. Derek Shaw was mid-sentence, something about speaking to the manager, about standards, about how certain people simply had no business being in certain places when Rex stood up. Not with the slow, deliberate movement he had used to place himself between Lily and the loud man. This was different. This was immediate. His ears went vertical. His nostrils flared 3 times in rapid succession. A sound rose in the back of his throat, low and tonal, the kind of sound that had no translation in the vocabulary of house pets or city dogs. The kind that belonged to a frequency Marcus had first heard on a rooftop in Mosul at 3 in the morning, seconds before the door behind them came apart. Marcus's hand moved without a thought, dropping to Lily's shoulder. His eyes went to the front of the room. The light through the floor-to-ceiling windows was the flat grey of a Chicago winter morning. The street outside looked normal. Then the black Ford Expedition came over the curb. It did not brake. It crossed the sidewalk at speed and hit the glass vestibule with a sound like the building exhaling a single percussive crash that sent the brass door frames inward and scattered the hostess's podium across 30 feet of marble. The room detonated into noise. Chairs scraped. Women screamed. A man in a grey suit threw himself flat under a table so fast he took a water glass with him. Derek Shaw, who 60 seconds ago had been informing a working-class father and his 5-year-old daughter about where they did and didn't belong, made a sound that was not words and dropped to his hands and knees and crawled toward the back of the pastry counter with the focused urgency of a man whose bravery, it turned out, was exclusively theoretical. 3 men stepped through the broken glass. They moved with the synchronized economy of people who had rehearsed the entry spacing perfect. Angles covered no wasted motion. The lead carried a suppressed HK MP7. The other 2 had SIG P320S, at the low ready, black balaclavas. Plate carriers under civilian windbreakers. Not a robbery. Too practiced, too specific. The lead man's eyes swept the room and settled on the corner table where Vivian Hart had already stood, her chair pushed back. Her face composed in the manner of someone who had understood the nature of this moment before it finished arriving. Nobody moves. On the floor, right now, his voice had the flat authority of someone accustomed to full compliance. Most of the room complied. Vivienne did not. She held still and held his gaze, because she had spent 20 years running a defense contractor through hostile acquisition attempts, congressional hearings, and 2 attempts on her board seats. And she had learned that the first thing you surrendered in a crisis was the only thing that couldn't be given back. Owen, her security detail, was 2 tables away and already reaching under his jacket. One of the flanking men tracked the movement. Gun, a 3-round burst chewed through the pillar 2 inches from Owen's head, and Owen went down behind an overturned mahogany table. Alive pinned his weapon still in his hand, but his angle gone. Marcus had already moved. In the fraction of a second between Rex's warning and the SUV hitting the glass, he had processed 3 things. Lily was to his left and needed to be lower and behind hard cover. Rex needed a command, not an instinct, and the man closest to him was going to pass within arm's reach. He pushed Lily under the steel base of the espresso counter, solid, heavy, the right geometry, and said one word to Rex Bewaken. Rex dropped to the floor and moved under the counter in the same motion, pressing his body across Lily's legs, his chin on her knees. The latch of his breathing changed. Steady. Slow. Deliberate. Lily made a sound. Rex lifted his muzzle and pressed it once gently against her cheek. She went still. The third mercenary was crossing toward Vivienne, heavy and fast, and his path took him directly alongside the counter. He was not watching the coffee shop furniture. He was watching the target. He had 4 inches and 60 pounds on Marcus, and he was wearing a plate carrier, and he had a loaded pistol in his right hand. And by every reasonable metric, he was not a problem that Marcus Cole, tired carpenter and single father, should have been capable of solving. Marcus reached across the counter without standing, closed his hand around the base of the thick ceramic sugar dispenser, and let the man take one more step. 1. Marcus stepped out of the blind spot he had been standing in for 45 seconds, the gap between the espresso machine and the structural pillar that the mercenaries' peripheral vision had already dismissed as empty, and he brought the base of the ceramic sugar dispenser down against the ceramic left side of the man's skull at the precise angle where the temporal bone meets the parietal, the junction that combat medicine refers to as the most reliable point of immediate incapacitation via blunt trauma. The ceramic shattered. The sound was not loud. The man's eyes disconnected from whatever they had been looking at, and his legs went out from under him, the way a building goes down in a controlled demolition, floor by floor, from the bottom. 2. Marcus caught the man's gun arm with his left hand as he stripped the P320 from his grip, with a practiced rotating motion before the man's knees touched the floor, and came up out of the crouch, with the weapon indexed toward the lead gunman, in a single connected movement that had no wasted arc. The lead gunman had heard the sound and was turning. He was fast. He was not fast enough. 2 rounds, both eyes open, muscle memory, doing the geometry that conscious thought was too slow to manage. Center mass. The MP7 hit the marble. The man hit the marble. The room had been holding its breath, and now it held it harder. The third mercenary, the one who had been suppressing Owen, who had been keeping Vivienne's security detail pinned behind the overturned table with controlled bursts, heard his team's cadence break. He turned. He leveled his weapon at Marcus. Vivienne Hart, who had remained standing throughout all of this, watched what happened next, with the focused attention of someone cataloguing something they know they will be asked to describe later. Marcus did not flinch. He sidestepped smooth and unhurried, creating a moving target where a stationary one had been, and fired 1 round. The bullet took the third man in the shoulder of his gun arm, the elbow joint, specifically, which is not where you aim when you intend to kill someone, which is precisely the point. The man's arm folded at the wrong angle, and his weapon clattered away, and he slid down the wall, conscious breathing, and finished as a threat. 3, or rather 0. It was over. The Meridian Lounge smelled of gunpowder and spilled coffee, and the particular sharp ozone of broken glass, and the only sounds were the rain beginning outside the distant siren that meant someone had already called 911, and the muffled sound of Derek Shaw crying behind the pastry counter with his arms over his head. Marcus stood at the center of the room, the P320 in a 2-handed high-ready position, his eyes moving across the entry in a systematic pattern that Owen, who had served 8 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment, recognized immediately. It was not the stance of a man who had defended himself. It was the stance of a man conducting a post-engagement site assessment. It lasted 4 seconds. Then Marcus engaged the safety on the weapon, set it carefully on the counter, away from the downed men, in plain sight, accessible to no one, and dropped to his knees in front of the espresso counter. Lily. Bug. Are you okay? Rex moved first. He came out from under the counter and pressed himself against Lily's legs, and Lily wrapped both arms around his neck with the grip of a child who had been terrified and was no longer willing to let go of the thing that had stayed with her through it. It was loud, Lily said, her voice, the specific flat tone of a child reporting from inside shock. I know, baby. Rex stayed with me the whole time. I know he did. He licked my face when I cried. Marcus put one hand on his daughter's back and one hand on his dog's side and knelt on the marble floor of an expensive coffee shop and breathed. Owen came around the overturned table with his weapon drawn and found a man kneeling between a child and a German shepherd, and he stood there for a moment with nothing useful to say. Vivienne Hart stood at the edge of the scene and looked at the man who had just neutralized a three-person tactical team with a sugar dispenser and a stolen pistol in under 5 seconds, and then returned immediately to being a father. And she thought about power, what it looked like when it was real, and what it looked like when it wasn't. And she thought about Derek Shaw behind the pastry counter. And she did not feel anything as simple as satisfaction, but she felt something adjacent to it. Something that had to do with the world briefly, making a kind of sense it usually didn't. Marcus did not wait for the police. He picked Lily up, she wrapped her legs around his waist, and her face went into the side of his neck, which was where she put it when the world was too much. And he walked to the back of the Meridian Lounge, through the service corridor that he had identified when they walked in. Past the stainless steel prep surfaces and the rack of white aprons, and he pushed open the heavy steel fire door at the end of the hallway and stepped into the narrow service alley behind the building. Rex followed 3 steps behind, which was where he always was. The alley was cold and wet and smelled of city garbage and exhaust, and the snow had turned to sleet, and none of that mattered. Marcus walked north until the alley turned, and then he stopped. He set Lily down against the wall and checked her hands, face, ears, with the methodical thoroughness of a field medic, who happened to also be her father. She had a small abrasion on her right palm from the marble floor. That was all. Rex sat in front of her and offered his face. Lily held it in both hands and looked at him with the earnest solemnity of someone conducting an important inspection. He's okay, she announced. Yeah, Marcus said. He is. They walked home through the sleet. Inside the Meridian Lounge, Owen coordinated with the arriving CPD units, while Vivienne sat in the back seat of her armored Maybach and watched the building through the rain-streaked glass and processed what she had seen. The 3 mercenaries were in custody. CPD had a name from the cafe's reservation system, a table booking that didn't match any of the mercenaries. A man and a child. Owen ran interference through 2 phone calls that he did not explain to Vivienne in detail, and she did not ask him to. And the name was quietly moved to a category of witness that the department's liaison office would follow up on through channels that did not involve a warrant. Their gear was ex-military, their movements were trained, and the funding trail, when Owen pulled it 2 hours later, pointed to Voss Dynamics, the private military contractor that had lost a $12 billion DoD contract to Hart Aerospace 8 months ago. Raymond Voss had escalated from litigation to assassination, which was desperate and messy, and told her that the financial pressure from losing that contract had done something to his decision-making. The man with the dog, she said. Owen was in the front seat. He met her eyes in the rearview mirror. Tier 1, he said. The way he moved the target acquisition, the economy of motion. That's not standard military. That's special mission units. I pulled the security footage before the server was logged into evidence. Vivienne looked at him. Find him. Owen hesitated. Ma'am, people who move like that and disappear into alleys don't particularly want to be found. He saved my life, Vivienne said. Find him. It took Owen and a team of Hart Aerospace's intelligence contractors 3 days. The footage, the traffic cameras, the ATM lens on West Armitage that caught a man and a child and a German shepherd at 1114 a.m., walking north backward, frame by frame, until a face matched a file. The file was classified at a level that required Owen to use resources Vivienne paid for specifically, to access resources that didn't officially exist. What they found: Marcus Cole, 36, Navy SEAL, DevGru, 12 years of service. His record was largely black ink and redacted operations across 4 continents. What was not redacted: his wife Claire had been killed by a drunk driver on North Clark Street 3 years ago while Marcus was on deployment in the Philippines. He had been notified by satellite phone. He had flown home, buried her, and submitted his paperwork the following week. Since then, a 2-bedroom house in Lincoln Square, a contractor's license, and a German shepherd with a DOD service number. In a separate action that took 45 minutes and 1 phone call, Vivienne withdrew Hart Aerospace's $500 million pension fund from Derek Shaw's firm, citing in writing a demonstrated failure of character in crisis, situations incompatible with the fiduciary judgment required to manage employee assets. She attached the security footage. Derek Shaw's keycard stopped working while he was in the middle of his second coffee of the morning. He was escorted to the elevator by building security. He was blacklisted from every major financial institution in the greater Chicago area within 72 hours. Meanwhile, a 12-second clip had escaped the cafe's cloud backup before the CPD server pull and had been posted by a sous chef who had been watching from the kitchen doorway. It was not the clip of Marcus, it was the clip of Rex, 90 seconds of a German shepherd lying flat over a 5-year-old girl in the corner of a destroyed coffee shop, surrounded by broken glass and spilled chocolate, and the aftermath of violence licking her face with steady, patient gentleness while she cried. The caption read, "Times, this dog stayed the whole time." Asterisk. In 48 hours, it had been viewed 11 million times. The Thursday afternoon was the color of old pewter, the kind of Chicago overcast that sat low on the rooftops and made the brick houses of Lincoln Square look like they had been drawn in pencil and left unfinished. Marcus was in the backyard, driving 16 penny nails into the frame of a cedar deck with a rhythm that had become over 3 years, one of the few things that required enough of his body to quiet his mind. Rex was lying in the dry patch under the eave overhang, tracking a squirrel on the fence, with the focused resignation of a professional who has accepted that some adversaries will simply never be engaged. Lily was at school. The house was quiet in the specific way. It was only quiet when she wasn't in it. He heard the car before he saw it. The Maybach's engine was nearly silent, but its weight displaced air differently than the Subarus and minivans that normally used this street. And Marcus had spent enough of his adult life in environments where vehicle profiling was a survival skill that his attention redirected before the sound, fully registered as conscious thought. He did not stop hammering. Rex raised his head. The gate at the side of the house opened, and Vivienne Hart stepped into the backyard, wearing a camel cashmere coat and boots with flat soles, which Marcus noted because people who visit work sites in heels are not thinking about work sites. She was carrying a shopping bag with the logo of a children's boutique on Michigan Avenue, and she stopped at the edge of the sawdust and looked at him with the directness of someone who had been thinking carefully about what to say and had decided to begin before she lost her nerve. Rex stood. He turned toward her. He stood there for a moment with his nose working, reading the information that humans cannot access the cortisol and adrenaline, and the trace chemistry of what a person is actually made of underneath their clothes and intentions, and then something in his posture changed. He crossed the yard and picked up a short cedar dowel from the scrap pile and walked to Vivienne and set it at her feet. Then he sat and looked at her and waited. It was the gesture Marcus had seen Rex make exactly twice before, both times toward people who later proved themselves entirely worthy of it. Vivienne looked down at the dowel. She looked at Rex. She looked at Marcus. "He did that on purpose," she said. "Yeah." What does it mean? Means he's decided you're not a threat. A pause. He doesn't do it often. Vivienne crouched and let Rex smell her hand, then scratched slowly behind his left ear. Rex closed his eyes for precisely 3 seconds, which was the most luxury he permitted himself in the presence of strangers. Then he returned to his spot under the eave, lay down, and went back to watching the squirrel. Marcus set his hammer on the rail and turned to face her. She told him what she knew about Voss dynamics, about the contract, about the escalation, about the 3 men in the cafe, and what they represented, which was not a one-time desperate act, but the opening move of a campaign. She told him she needed someone who thought like them to dismantle it from the inside. She told him she would pay $2 million. She told him she would secure Lily in the process, and then she stopped talking and let the offer sit in the air between them. Marcus looked at the cedar deck frame, at the grain of the wood where he'd been driving nails. My daughter grew up while I was in a trench somewhere, deciding other people's arguments for them, he said. He was not angry. He was simply stating the geography of his life. I missed her first steps. I missed her first words. I flew home in a dress uniform for my wife's funeral and wore a row of medals that couldn't do a single useful thing. He turned the hammer over in his hand once. I'm done with other people's wars, Miss Hart. Vivienne nodded. She did not argue. She set the shopping bag on the workbench. Inside was a pair of yellow rain boots in Lily's size and 3 picture books, and no further negotiation. And she turned to leave. She was at the gate when Rex stood up. He was not looking at the squirrel anymore. His ears were fully erect, rotating forward. A sound came from the back of his throat. Not a bark, something lower and more deliberate. A frequency Marcus associated with a specific category of warning. He followed Rex's line of sight to the end of the block. A matte black transit van was parked against the curb, where no transit van had any reason to be. Engine running, rear suspension sitting heavy. A convex reflection in the driver's side mirror at an angle consistent with an optical scope operating from the cargo space. Marcus looked at it for 2 seconds. Then he said quietly to the woman standing at his gate, "Don't go to your car." Marcus moved through his own kitchen in the dark, the way he had once moved through structures in Kandahar and Ramadi and a dozen other places that did not appear on the operational maps. He was allowed to discuss not because the darkness was an advantage in itself, but because it equalized a situation that was currently disadvantaged. He had killed the lights on the ground floor the moment he got Vivienne inside. He had sent her upstairs with 2 words, Lily's room. She had not argued. The sound he heard as he moved was familiar and wrong. The specific quiet of a neighborhood that does not know it has become a battlefield. The craftsman houses of Lincoln Square were 40 feet apart, older construction, good insulation. He had installed a Bluetooth speaker in the basement 3 months ago, connected to a loop of workshop, noise circular saw, nail gun drill. He activated it from his phone as he cleared the living room. To anyone outside the house was alive, with the sounds of a man doing weekend work. He had not planned this. He had simply built it, the sort of preparation that becomes instinct after enough years of living in the space between threat and response. He had no service weapons in the house. The Navy did not allow operators to retire with M4S and suppressors. What he had was a 22-ounce Est-wing framing hammer, a pass-load cordless nail gun loaded with 3-inch ring shanks, a length of high-tension mason's twine he had been using for the deck layout, and a cast-iron plumb bob on a braided cord. Also Rex, though Rex was upstairs following a command Marcus had given him with a word that had no English equivalent, and everything to do with the fact that Lily was in that room. Vivienne had found Lily awake, sitting up in bed, with her stuffed rabbit in her lap and a look on her face that was too calm to be innocent. "I heard the sounds stop," Lily said. "The house sounds. Your dad turned them off." "Vivienne?" said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "He's working." "He's not working," Lily said. "Rex knows." Rex was lying in front of the door. His chin was on the floor, pressed flat, which was how he pressed his ears to the boards, to track movement on the level below. His eyes were open. Every few seconds his gaze moved, processing. "Is my dad going to be okay?" Vivienne put her hand over Lily's. She thought about what she knew about the man downstairs, what he had done in a coffee shop with a sugar dispenser, and 3 seconds, what his file described in the language of redacted operations, what his dog knew about him that no file could contain. "Yes," she said. She meant it. Downstairs, the front door came apart at the deadbolt with the muffled concussion of a breaching round. Price Hayes entered first because Hayes always entered first. Because Hayes had been a CIA Special Activities officer before the oversight review that ended his clearance, and he had never once in 15 years needed to go second. He swept the entry corridor with his light. Marcus had strung the mason's twine across the baseboard, at ankle height, dark cord against dark floor. In the 8 seconds between hearing the van doors open and the footsteps on the porch, the first man's boot snagged it. His weight shifted. Marcus came out of the living room archway and drove the est wing upward in the arc that the manual calls a rising strike and experience calls efficient, and the man went down without finishing the step. Marcus caught his vest and moved him behind the drywall partition before the second man through the door cleared his sight line. The second man came through the kitchen, which was the choice Marcus had expected because it was the tactically correct choice, and Hayes's people were trained. Marcus was on top of the cabinets, and he came down on the man's back with his full weight and the heel of the est wing against the base of the man's skull at the mastoid, the point where the bone is thinnest and the impact carries cleanest. The man went down hard against the granite and did not get up. 2. Hayes and the final contractor came through the back window, which was also the correct tactical choice, which was why Marcus had left it apparently undefended. Hayes activated the device, a compact, ultrasonic emitter, black market, K9, countermeasure, the kind of thing that cost $4,000 and was designed to operate in short bursts, each pulse lasting 4 seconds before the unit cycled to prevent overheating. Upstairs, Rex's legs buckled. He pressed himself against the wall and his breath came in shallow bursts, and he couldn't orient. Lily slid off the bed onto the floor next to him. She put both her small hands on the sides of his face, not covering his ears, just holding him the way you hold something you are not willing to let go of, and she began to sing low and tuneless, the fragment of a lullaby Marcus sang to her on the hard nights. The device cycled. In the 4-second silence between pulses, Rex's vestibular system partially reset. His eyes found her face. When the next pulse came, he had something to orient to that was not the floor. Downstairs, Marcus took a brick fragment from the shattered fireplace in the shoulder and registered it and continued. The Lenko Bearcat that arrived at the Lincoln Square house 12 minutes after the last shot wore no police markings, and the 6 men who stepped out of it wore no agency identification, and they moved through the house and the surrounding block with a practiced efficiency that the 2 CPD officers who had been flagged off the scene by a phone call they were not cleared to question, found deeply confusing and chose not to examine further. Vivienne Hart ran the kind of operation that had protocols for this. Marcus sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the refrigerator while a woman named Priya, who had field medicine qualifications that she could not list on any public resume, removed a fragment of brick from his left shoulder with the focused calm of someone who had done this in worse rooms than this. Lily was asleep on the couch. Rex curled against her legs, his eyes tracking the unfamiliar personnel moving through the house with professional suspicion and permitting their presence because Marcus had used the Dutch word that meant permitted. When Priya finished and stepped away, Marcus stood. Vivienne found him at the counter with his hands flat on the granite and his eyes on the window above the sink. The house smelled of plaster dust and the sharp chemical residue of the stun grenade Hayes had deployed in the living room. "They came here," Marcus said. He did not look at her. "They came to my house. They came to the street where my daughter walks to school." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll finish it," he said. "Not for the money, because it doesn't end until it ends." Vivienne said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The drive north took 50 minutes. Marcus watched the city give way to the industrial corridor north of Waukegan through the Bearcat's porthole and recognized the geography. Naval Station Great Lakes was 12 miles ahead. The base where he had completed his initial SEAL qualification 18 years ago, where he had learned to run in sand at 4 in the morning, and had decided, somewhere around mile 7 of a 14-mile night ruck, that discomfort was just information. Hart Aerospace's research facility was not on the base. It was in a converted manufacturing plant in a commercial park that shared a fence line with the base's eastern perimeter, which was the kind of adjacency that benefited from proximity without requiring disclosure. The blast doors were 2 feet of reinforced steel. The air was recycled independently of the municipal system. The server node was hardened against EMP. Lily woke up long enough to ask if they were at a hotel and went back to sleep without waiting for an answer. Marcus stood at the long steel workbench in the main bay while Owen laid out the equipment plate carrier modified Glock primary rifle, and Vivienne walked him through the Voss Dynamics building layout on the holographic display, which was better than anything he'd worked with on active duty, which said something either about the state of defense contracting or about what Vivienne Hart spent her infrastructure budget on. Then Owen's phone rang and Owen stepped away and the room was briefly quiet. Rex crossed the floor and stopped beside Marcus. His nose went to the faded Carhartt jacket folded on the end of the workbench. Marcus had set it there when he came in, the way he always set it somewhere specific so he would know where it was. Rex worked his muzzle into the inside pocket with the careful precision he used for sensitive retrieval. He set what he found on the workbench beside the plate carrier. It was a grey wool glove, knit pilled at the thumb, missing 2 stitches at the cuff. Marcus had carried it in the inside pocket of his jacket for 3 years. He had not told anyone why. He had not taken it out in anyone's presence. Rex had felt it there through the fabric. Every time Marcus had suited up for the cold, every winter morning on the deck, every school drop-off, every night errand. He had known it was there, the way he knew everything about the man he was attached to, not through language but through the long accumulation of proximity and attention that is. In the end, its own kind of devotion. Marcus looked at the glove on the workbench. His jaw tightened. He picked it up. He held it for a moment with both hands, and then folded it and set it back in his inside pocket, next to where it always went. Then he crouched in front of Rex and put one hand on each side of the dog's face. The way you hold something you are not willing to lose. And he stayed there for a count of 3. Rex held still. He had learned years ago that sometimes the most useful thing was not a skill, but a willingness to be present for the weight of something. Marcus stood. He began to put on the plate carrier. Vivienne, who had been watching from across the room, did not say anything for a long moment. "Then come back." Marcus checked the retention on the Glock. "That's the plan. The Chicago underground is not a metaphor. It is a physical thing, a network of freight tunnels, utility corridors and maintenance infrastructure that was built at the turn of the century to move coal and parcels beneath the loop and has since been appropriated by every subsequent generation of engineers, service contractors, and in the current context, a former Naval Special Warfare Development Group operator with a shoulder wound, a suppressed Sig Sauer, and 6 hours until the FBI's wire transfer monitoring would flag the last of Raymond Voss's financial exits. Marcus entered the tunnel system through a maintenance access point in the service alley behind a parking structure on East Illinois, 2 blocks east of the Voss Dynamics Tower. The entry required a tool Owen had provided, which looked like a modified combi tool, and opened the access plate in 11 seconds. The tunnel beneath was cold and narrow and smelled of concrete and old electrical insulation and the particular staleness of air that has been recycled by machines for decades. He moved by the light of a dim red headlamp, which preserved his night adaptation and was invisible outside the tunnel from any distance that mattered. SEAL qualification involved extended underwater navigation, closed space infiltration, and the kind of vertical movement training that most military specialties do not emphasize, because most military specialties do not need to ascend the inside of a building unseen from street level. Marcus had done it in training scenarios and in 3 operational environments, and he had never enjoyed it, and it had never failed him, which was the relationship he had with most of the useful things in his life. The access shaft connecting the tunnel network to the Voss Tower's utility infrastructure was behind a locked gate that required a biometric override for personnel on the building's authorized list. It required something different for everyone else, which Owen had also provided a 12-second loop injected into the building's internal authentication system that substituted a null response for a denial response. The gate opened. Marcus began to climb. The injury in his shoulder was information. He processed it as such. The shaft was 60 feet of vertical ladder in near-total darkness, and his left arm had perhaps 70% of its normal grip strength. And these were the parameters, and the parameters were navigable. He came up through a utility hatch on the 35th floor into a corridor that smelled of recycled air and corporate carpet, where 2 guards were standing by the elevator bank, discussing the bulls with the comfortable inattention of men who have been told their building is secure. Marcus had been in the ceiling space for 4 minutes before they noticed the fluorescent tube above the hatch had gone dark. By then the corridor was silent. He moved upward through the stairwell, clearing each landing with the economy of motion that comes from training that has been repeated until it becomes architecture, something built into the body's decision-making below the level of conscious thought. On the 38th floor, he encountered the heavy resistance Owen had mapped 8-man sweep team emergency lighting open plan. He did not engage them in sequence. He introduced a stun grenade into the room's center and moved through the door before the echo finished, because the window between sensory disruption and motor recovery is exactly long enough for a man who has practiced it to do what needs to be done. He aimed exclusively for plate carriers. He was not there to kill anyone who hadn't made the choice to put a gun in a little girl's neighborhood. He was there to remove the ability to make further choices of that nature, which is a different project and requires different accuracy. He found 1 guard, young, 23, at most, sitting in a stairwell on the 39th floor with his phone in his hand and his rifle against the wall, not guarding anything, just existing in the wrong building at the wrong time, for reasons Marcus guessed had more to do with debt than ideology. He heard Marcus before he saw him. His hand went for the rifle. Marcus said from the shadows, "Don't." The hand stopped. "There's an east stairwell 2 doors down," Marcus said. "Walk to it. Go down. Don't call anyone until you're outside the building." The guard looked at him at the tactical gear and the suppressed weapon, and the look behind the eyes that communicated, without ambiguity, the full scope of what this man was capable of and was choosing not to do. He stood up. He walked east. He did not call anyone until he was outside the building, and when he did, the call was to his wife, and he said he was coming home early. At Hart Aerospace's facility north of Waukegan, Vivienne was on a live feed through the building's looped security cameras. Rex was sitting directly in front of the monitor. He had not moved in 4 hours. He was watching the icon on the tactical GPS that Vivienne had mapped to the screen Marcus's position, climbing floor by floor through the Voss Tower. Every time the icon moved, Rex's ears adjusted. He was tracking his partner through a screen in a language he had invented for himself, because the alternative, not knowing, was not something Rex had ever been willing to accept. Raymond Voss was a tall man, who wore his authority the way certain men wear bespoke suits, as if removing it was not an option he had considered, as if the fabric and the power were the same continuous thing. He was standing at the center of his penthouse office when Marcus came through the biometric door, and he was flanked by 4 men in level 4 assault armor, who were very good at their jobs, and had been told that the building's security breach was a single intruder, and had calibrated their response accordingly, which was a calibration error. Marcus did not engage them from the door. He moved laterally the moment he cleared the threshold, using the obsidian floor's low friction to slide behind the first structural column as the first burst of 56 chewed through the glass behind him. He counted the burst lengths and the reload intervals from behind the column, and when the interval came, he came around the column's left edge with the Glock already indexing, and he shot low femoral area, the gap below the plate carrier's lower edge, because the objective was to stop and not to kill. And because Lily was going to ask him eventually what he had done in the tall building, and he wanted to be able to answer in a way that she could carry without weight. 2 men went down. The third charged, abandoning his rifle, which was the kind of tactical decision that desperation produces. And Marcus met him inside his reach and used the butt of the Glock against the man's chin in a motion that ended the conversation, cleanly. The fourth came at him around the mahogany desk in a tackle that caught Marcus in the injured shoulder and drove him into the server rack with a sound like a car door closing. And there was a moment, brief, genuine, where the shoulder and the fatigue and the long climb all registered at once. And Marcus was simply a 36-year-old man who had been awake for 22 hours and was very tired. He wrapped his right arm around the man's neck from behind and applied pressure to the carotid until the struggling stopped. He let him down. He stood up. He looked at Voss. The bespoke suit was still perfect. The man inside it had changed. The crystal tumbler of scotch was on the floor, where it had fallen from fingers that had watched 4 elite private security contractors neutralized in 40 seconds and had processed the information correctly. "Wait," Voss said. His voice had the quality of something being held together by habit. "Listen to me. Whatever Hart is paying you, triple it. 10 million wired tonight, offshore account of your choosing. You and your daughter disappear. You never have to. You sent men with guns into my daughter's neighborhood," Marcus said. He crossed the room. He stopped 2 feet from Voss. His voice was not angry. Anger was a feeling, and feelings required surplus energy that he was not currently carrying. "You paid someone to put a weapon in the same air as my 5-year-old. There is no number." He reached out, took Voss by the lapel of the bespoke suit, and moved him against the server rack with a controlled force that produced pain without damage because the FBI was 11 minutes away, and Vivienne needed Voss capable of standing in front of a federal judge. "Vivienne." His radio. "I have the servers. Downloading the decryption keys now." Her voice had the quality of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular door to open. "I have the black contracts. I have the assassination authorization documents. I have 4 years of bribed federal officials and fraudulent DOD invoices." A pause, briefer than a breath. "Marcus, Voss Dynamics is finished. The FBI will be through his front door in 10 minutes. Voss's legs stopped holding him up. He slid down the server rack to the obsidian floor, and the suit finally looked like what it was, fabric on a man who had confused the 2 things for long enough that losing one felt like losing both. Marcus holstered the Glock and walked to the window and looked out at Chicago from 42 stories up the lake to the east, going black at the edge of the sodium lights. the grid of the city below him laid out with the clarity that altitude provides. He pressed the radio. Lily Vivienne understood. Asleep. Rex is next to her. He hasn't moved. Marcus stayed at the window for one more moment. Then he turned and walked to the door. The Tuesday morning, 7 days later, had the quality of Chicago in December, when the wind is not yet serious. Cold enough to warrant the flannel shirt Marcus was wearing over a Henley. Warm enough to leave the jacket by the door. He was at the kitchen island assembling a wooden dollhouse. Small hinges, cedar panels, a working front door with a tiny brass knocker that Lily had chosen from the hardware store with the gravity of someone making an irreversible decision. Rex was asleep under the kitchen table, which was technically not permitted and had been technically not permitted for 3 years. The doorbell rang. Vivienne was standing on the porch in dark jeans and a grey sweater, without the corporate architecture that usually surrounded her, and she looked, Marcus thought, like a person which she was, and which the CEO context had previously made harder to see. "Owen is around the block," she said. "He refused to park the Maybach on your street. He said it was bad for neighborhood property values." "He's right." She stepped inside. She looked at the kitchen, the sawdust and the coffee and the half-assembled dollhouse and Rex's tail visible from under the table, and the quality of quiet that a house has when a child lives in it and is currently at school. "Voss Dynamics filed for bankruptcy this morning," she said. Raymond Voss was indicted on 38 federal counts. His legal team is estimating 12 to 15 years minimum. Good, Marcus said. He set a small cedar panel in place and tested the fit. She reached into her coat and took out a sealed envelope and slid it across the granite counter. "Your fee." As agreed. Marcus did not look at the envelope. He kept his attention on the hinge. "I told you, when we started, I didn't do it for the money." "I know," Vivienne said. "It's for Lily. For college. For as many $14 hot chocolates as she wants." Something in Marcus's expression shifted, not a smile. "Exactly. But the thing that exists, one layer beneath a smile, in people who have learned to be careful with them." He looked up at her. "She asked about you this morning," he said. "She wanted to know if the lady in the camel coat was coming back." Vivienne felt something she did not immediately have a name for, something that had to do with rooms she hadn't been in before. Rex came out from under the table. He crossed the kitchen to where Vivienne was standing. He placed his head on her thigh and looked up at her with his amber eyes, and she put her hand on his head, and he closed his eyes. "He doesn't do that with everyone," Marcus said. "I know," Vivienne said. "He told me the first day." Marcus poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one in front of her. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the December light was thin and silver and entirely without apology. And the city went on doing what it always did, steadily, without drama. While inside the Craftsman house on North Oakley, a man and a woman and a German shepherd, who had all been carrying things for a long time, put them down, briefly, and let the morning be what it was. If Rex choosing Vivienne at the end didn't get you nothing, we'll drop a comment telling me your favorite moment from Marcus and Rex's story. And let me know where in the world you're watching from. Like and subscribe so you never miss the next one.